with it, and we'll start. So today, people are still joining, but we are very happy to have you here tonight, and to start the day with another session of this, lecture series, Medieval Landscape of Anatolia, that we started with Burcu and the IFEA. So we'd like to, of course, to thank the IFEA and the other institution, METU and Sorbonne Université for the organization of this seminar, and to wish you all, of course, our best wishes for this new year, because we are starting this new year. I mean, I don't know. In France, you can wish it until the end of January, so I hope. So today we are thrilled to welcome you online, Oya Pancaroğlu, who are, professor of Islamic art at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. And Oya is, of course, very well known for everybody who has an interest in the medieval Anatolia, societies and material culture. So I won't go too long into the introduction. You have, intensively taught and published, articles and books about visual culture of the Persianate world, figural representation in medieval Anatolia, but also more broadly in the Islamic world, and Islamic architecture in Anatolia. And I guess you will have your talk will have a link with this question of Islamic architecture also in Anatolia. So in this specific field, Professor Pancaroğlu has published a book about the Divri complex that most of us know about, and some of your upcoming articles will address this question of Islamic architecture in Anatolia. So one which should be published this year in the festschrift for Gülrün Ecipolu, entitled Solomon and Bilqis Encoded, a new interpretation of the mosque and hospital portals in Divri, but also other paper on the great mosque of Hamid, so Diyarbakir, reconsidered. And today, Oya will be talking about Central Anatolia, Cappadocia, and its settlement histories through, I guess, archival documents in a talk entitled Town and Country in Medieval Cappadocia, the view from endowment deeds and records. So we thank you very much, Oya, for having accepted to be part of this lecture series, and the floor is yours, and we look very much forward to listening to you and have the discussion after all.
Okay, thank you, Maxime, and welcome everybody. Let me first start by sharing my PowerPoint. Okay. Yes, so thank you also for the invitation to Maxime and to Burcu to include me in this very interesting lecture series. And apparently I had to get just such an invitation to realize that some of my research actually fits into a category or subject area that I had not really considered as something that I do. So, I mean, of course, I had thought about landscape, especially the Anatolian landscape, but funnily enough, I hadn't realized that somehow landscape had worked itself into my research. There are things one doesn't realize until one gets, I guess, invited. So, I mean, looking back, I realized that not only have I focused largely on small towns such as Divri, Beyşehir, and Ahlat, with buildings rather than the town as such as my starting point, but also that more and more I have been paying attention to the building's location, siting, and so forth, as I think obviously one should. More to the point, while I was thinking that I was working on this or that building, that is working on architecture, I was apparently also working on landscape to some extent. So this is the reason for this is partly because over the years I have become quite keen on scrutinizing available documentation on medieval endowments, the vakıf in Turkish, whether it is the actual surviving medieval endowment document or copy thereof, or their reflections in 15th and 16th century Ottoman surveys and registers, the so-called tahrir of the lands which came under Ottoman rule. I must admit that initially my interest in this documentation stemmed from a desire to find information on the actual day-to-day functioning of buildings, or how their functioning was envisioned at the beginning, of their life, supported by endowments. So questions like, how many teachers employed in a medrese, the services provided in a caravanserai, the food distributed on Fridays, etc. However, in time, I started to be interested also in the types and locations of the endowed properties, the income from which enabled the operations of the building. Initially, I think I was looking up this information in order to form a fuller idea of the patron and the basis of his or her patronage. So I wasn't looking for landscape, but I was looking at landscape because this information really does reflect relationships between urban and rural contexts and entities. So, and all the more so, I think, when it comes to smaller towns or medium and small towns. So today, what I want to present is a kind of a case study for the urban-rural dynamic of medieval Anatolia through the extant endowment deeds and Ottoman Tahrir records. And when I was first asked to provide a title for this, I was a bit over-ambitious, as one tends to be. But as I start to think about it, I realized it would be more manageable to focus on one town rather than all of Cappadocia. And I chose to focus on the southern Cappadocian town of Niğde as my case study, which and you see there on my PowerPoint there, a photograph of Niğde taken from the east from some distance in 1909 by Gertrude Bell. Okay. Why Niğde, you might ask? I had a few reasons for choosing it. One is, basically it's not an unknown entity, right? But it's less scrutinized compared to larger cities, such as, Konya. So one reason that I think is a useful case study is, first of all, the availability of the documentation in the form of at least one original endowment deed, the Ak Medrese endowment deed, Karamanid period 1415, and two Ottoman registers that are Tahrir Defteri from the 15th century, one from 1476, that's the first one, and then 1483, and they're very close in time to each other. There are actually three more from the 16th century, but I've put those aside. So that's one reason, the availability of these, a documentation on the endowments. The second is there's an interesting or a good balance between major and minor endowments between the 13th and the 15th centuries. And maybe this is true for many other places as well, but Niğde does fit into that category. Then it's also interesting because it's located on a major route connecting central Anatolia to the Mediterranean. Not only is it on a major route, which you see on this map, but it's part of obviously a network of roads as well. But the particular road that Niğde is on starts, there are a number of roads leading to it, but one road obviously leads to Kayseri, another one more immediately to the north, and then moving around the Melendez Mountains and Hasanda here, you come to Aksaray, and then further west, obviously into Konya, and then south through the Cilician Gates down here, obviously to the Mediterranean. Now, this is obviously, as we know, for Cappadocia, sort of a volcanic landscape, but also is a particularly rich landscape, not only for agriculture, but also for mining, especially silver mining. So there are known silver mines going back, it seems, back to the, probably Bronze Age or Iron Age, east of Niğde, and then also in the mountains to the south. So that makes it, I think, interesting case when you're looking at endowments and patrons and who is involved in what kind of, resource. And then there is a kind of a set of moderately well-preserved medieval buildings. The buildings themselves are not entirely sufficient to have a sense of the medieval urban fabric, but combined with the information from these sources, the buildings expand our understanding of both the city and the landscape around it. Okay, now, of course, it would take too long to look at all the endowments for Niğde and their properties for which we have information. So I made a selection of 4 major endowments covering a period of about 100 years for which we know who the patron is. We know and we can identify that person and the date of the endowment approximately or sometimes precisely. So the earliest one that I've picked, it's actually a double endowment in the sense that in the registers, in the 1476 and 1483 registers, there are 2 entries for this patron, and she is Hüdavendt Hatun, who is a daughter of the Seljuk Sultan, the sort of latter-day Seljuk Sultan Kılıç Arslan IV. And her endowments are probably from after about 1300, so in the first or second decade of the 14th century. One of her endowments was established to provide income not for an institution or a building, but for her freed slaves and their descendants, which is sort of a type of endowment that's like a family endowment, which is actually a fairly common type. Her second endowment is established to support a zaviye, or what's in one of the Tahrir registers calls it a zaviye, the other one calls it an imaret, but they're, I think, referring to it basically something like a Sufi lodge. So unfortunately, this zaviye has not survived as a physical structure, but there is good reason to assume that it was in the vicinity of Hüdavendt Hatun's tomb, which has survived, which is standing and is actually, architecturally speaking, one of the most celebrated tombs of medieval Anatolia. Another endowment was established, that's my second case, or third endowment, was established in the 1330s by the Ilkhanid emir named Sungur Ağa to support the Friday mosque that he built. This is the second Friday mosque to be built in Niğde. The first one is from the 1220s, which I'm not going to look at because I picked these, basically one reason I picked these is they're relatively close in time to each other. If I had included the first Friday mosque, we would have a kind of a gap of about 100 years between the first and the second one. So I kind of wanted to avoid that. The fourth endowment was established by the Karamanid prince and governor of Niğde, Ali Bey, in 1415 to support his medrese, known as the Ak Medrese, which was built a few years earlier. So for the first 3, we have to so the Hüdavendt Hatun endowments and the Sungur Ağa endowments, we have to rely on these 15th century Ottoman Tahrir records. But for Ali Bey's endowment, we also have the original endowment document in the collection of the Topkapı Palace Museum, Library Museum. So in addition to, of course, it's also mentioned in both the 1476 and 1483 endowment records. And then finally, to kind of balance out the picture of urban-rural dynamics of 14th, 15th century Niğde, I will also look at some minor, somewhat more modest endowments at the end of the lecture. In fact, these are all endowments for neighborhood mosques or masjids. And it's remarkable that Niğde, which is not known to be a large medieval town, had over a dozen neighborhood masjids in the 15th century. Now, we cannot actually date those endowments in the same way that we can date the major endowments. But these masjids date most likely from the early 14th, and perhaps some of them even from the 13th century, to the late 15th century. So they're roughly contemporary with the major endowments. And I will proceed chronologically with the four major endowments. But I think in order to kind of widen our perspective on medieval Niğde, we need to start a little bit earlier. So the name Niğde, as we pronounce it, it's not actually attested in any source prior to the 13th century. So, and when we begin to see the name in the sources, it's spelled in a few slightly different ways from each other. You have Nakida, Nakida, Nakita, Nekide. If you say Nekide fast enough, multiple times, you can listen to yourself. It sounds like Niğde. So you can see how we get Niğde from Nakida. And so clearly Niğde evolved from this name Nakida, and the name Nakida, I think to a number of people, it sounds or has sounded rather like a Hittite toponym. Okay, so although there is no evidence for it otherwise, just the sound of it has made, people have suggested that it may be one of these Hittite place names. Now, despite the apparent absence of this name prior to the 13th century, it is unlikely to be a brand new Seljuk period settlement. Its location on a major route, as I mentioned before, connecting central Anatolia to the Cilician Gates, and from there to the Mediterranean, suggests that it may have been at least a minor fortified settlement on that route. The walls of Niğde, which are not particularly well preserved nor studied, enclose a hill, which you see in Albert Gabriel's plan that he made a long time ago now, but it's still, as most of his drawings are still in currency, right? These walls enclose a hill that extend from north to south, and you see that hill also in this old postcard, and that it was also visible in the Gertrude Bell photograph, with a citadel at the northern end, which you see here, and this Albert Gabriel photograph, you see here the northern end, and that's this end in the plan. The site also includes some apparently subterranean habitation, which is typical of Cappadocia at large. So presumably the site must have an earlier Byzantine history, and perhaps also a much older, even Hittite or Bronze Age history as well. In fact, a number of Hittite stelae have been found in the region of Niğde. There has been speculation that there may have been also a set of walls that incorporated the lower town, so a set of walls that would have maybe extended this way. And that would have incorporated this lower town that we see here. Which it kind of makes sense. And if we, of course, we have such configurations in other towns. Also, there's a small 16th century Ottoman mosque to the west. Its name is Dışarı Cami, so the external mosque. And that name only makes sense if the mosque was built outside of the city walls. But there's one very, like a one sentence mention by Halil Ethem, who wrote a little guide to Niğde. And he mentions that between 1900 and 1909, they undertook some excavations in Niğde. I presume he doesn't give a precise area, but he says in the west. And he says they saw foundations of walls but that they were not able to follow the line. So it's a small piece of, I don't know if it's evidence, but it's an interesting thing. And if we put a lot of things together, it makes sense. Now, whatever its earliest history may have been, it seems that Niğde's rise as an urban center went hand in hand with the dominance of the Seljuks over central Anatolia. The rise of Niğde also appears to be linked loosely to the decline in the earlier medieval period of the ancient city of Tiana, modern Kemerhisar, further south. Niğde's rise to relative prominence also should be considered in its frontier context, as the region of southern Cappadocia formed the border zone with the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia to the south. Now, we have one relatively reliable local source on Niğde, written by a 14th century native of the town, Kadı Ahmet. Unfortunately, he doesn't say as much about the town as one would like, but one interesting detail is his mention that one of the gates of the city carried an inscription of Kılıç Arslan II carved on a marble plaque, which indicates Seljuk investment or reinvestment in the fortifications of Niğde already in the latter part of the 12th century. One of the more interesting mentions of Niğde with respect to the topic of the relationship between urban and rural comes from the 13th century Anatolian Seljuk historian Ibn Bibi. In the struggle for succession to the Seljuk throne that took place between the sibling princes İzzettin Keykavus and Alaaddin Keykubat in 1211, there is an episode where Alaaddin Keykubat famously retreats to Ankara as his brother is gaining the upper hand over him. One of Alaaddin Keykubat's supporters in this struggle is the high-ranking emir Zahireddin İli, a member of the vanquished Danişmend dynasty. So when Alaaddin Keykubat retreats to Ankara, this Zahireddin İli shows up in Niğde and tries to win over the population. And apparently, according to Ibn Bibi, he does this not only by distributing lots of money and gifts to the townspeople, but also giving them guarantees for their continued possession of their suburban agricultural properties. And specifically, he mentions orchards and vineyards. And he says, I will guarantee these in case of military conflict. Now, we can derive three basic observations from this account. One is the suburban gardens, orchards, and vineyards surrounding the city were probably the prime asset of Niğde at that time. They were vulnerable, obviously, to damage and destruction in times of violence. And in times of grave political uncertainty or contestation, private ownership of agricultural property apparently became a particular stake to be negotiated, guaranteed, etc. Of course, none of this is surprising as such, but I think it's nonetheless important that it is mentioned, and also to note that the matter of suburban agricultural property and private ownership kind of bubbles up to the surface, especially in an uncertain political context. Okay, so let's look at our first major endowment, which is the double endowment of Hüdavenk Hatun. First, a little bit about what we know of Hüdavenk Hatun's rather interesting biography. We know that she's a daughter of Sultan Kılıç Arslan I. And just to give you, for those who may not be familiar with the political history of second part of the 13th century, is you can see he had three reign dates. The first one is where he's ruling in tandem with his two brothers, and then the next one with one brother, and then finally the last one supposedly on his own, but not really. It's interesting. His biography is also quite interesting, but so is his daughter. So she must have been born because he's killed in 1266. Kılıç Arslan IV. So she must have been born before 1266, on or before 1266. But we know more specifically that she died in 1332 in Niğde. And as I mentioned, we have two endowments of hers in Niğde, one to support the descendants of her freed slaves, the second one to support Ezaviye. Now, we have also several separate mentions of a daughter of Kılıç Arslan IV, and it seems that likely that all of them refer to the same woman. So I put these in chronological order. One mention coming from Ibn Bibi, who talks about Seljuki Hatun as a daughter of Kılıç Arslan II, mentions her as a Melike-i Muazzama, the exalted queen or princess, who was sent to Tabriz in 1276 to marry the Ilkhanid prince Argun, who at that time was still a prince. In 1284, he became the Ilkhan. Then the second mention of Khudavend Hatun is an inscription in Tokat from a Zaviye of Halef Gazi, where, again, daughter of Kılıç Arslan IV, in this case mentioned as Seljuki Khwand, and also as El Melike El Muazzama, and the date is 1292. So the interpretation of this, one main interpretation of this, is that because her husband, the Ilkhan Argun, died in 1291, that she apparently came back to Anatolia, and in the next year her name pops up in this foundation inscription, not as the patron, but as indicator of sort of who is in charge around the year 1292. Then we have what I call a bill of sale in Tokat. This was published many years ago by Zeki Oral, which mentions not a Seljuki Hatun, but Sultan Hatun, but again indicated as daughter of Kılıç Arslan, again mentioned as El Melike El Muazzama, and here she's purchasing a small village, a mezra, near Tokat. And she's purchasing it by the agency of her representative, someone named Şucaettin Uğurlu, in the year 1303. Now, that name is going to come up again, this Şucaettin. And the fourth mention, it comes from her tomb, which you have here on the left, in Niğde, the inscriptions on the tomb. One is, of course, the foundation inscription that mentions her as now Khudavend Hatun, again, daughter of Kılıç Arslan. It's the foundation inscription is dated 1213. And inside the cenotaph, where she's mentioned as El Melike Khwand Hatun, has the date 1332. That's her death date. So clearly she had this built a good 20 years earlier, and died 20 years later in 1332. And then the last one I've included here, it doesn't mention her, it doesn't mention Khudavend Hatun, but it mentions another woman named Pasha Hatun, who is, according to the cenotaph inscription, a daughter of the Emir Şucaettin, and it's dated 1344. Now, it's assumed, or not, it hasn't been exactly assumed, but one suggestion is that Pasha Hatun maybe the reason that she's buried in this tomb built by Khudavend Hatun is that she may have been a daughter of Khudavend Hatun. But of course, the inscription doesn't say who her mother is, it says who her father is. And the father's name, Şucaettin, matches the name of Khudavend Hatun's or Sultan Hatun's representative, Şucaettin. So all these, if we connect the dots between these four mentions, or four places where she's mentioned, they all seem to refer to the same woman. So we don't know where she was born. She may have been born in Tokat or some region, probably not in Konya, but at least we know that she was sent to Tabriz. She marries Argun, but then apparently she comes back to Tokat, where she's somehow associated with this Şucaettin figure, and then ends up in Niğde. Okay, to look at her endowments, she is also listed in both the 1476 and 1483 registries as the founder of two endowments in Niğde. One, as I mentioned, is her imaret/zaviye, and the other one to benefit the descendants of her freed slaves. So to look at what was in the endowment of the zaviye, I've kind of, tried to kind of summarize it or make it a kind of a easy list to follow without too many details on it. So two villages near Niğde. Presumably when we say two villages, what we're supposed to understand is that she had the authority to collect the taxes, the tax revenues of those villages. So two of those villages were near Niğde, one village near Andığı, which is the modern Altunhisar, west of Niğde. Two vineyards, they're mentioned as Arz-ı Kerem, adjacent, it says specifically, to the Zaviye. One mezra, a small village near Niğde, and then a number of gardens and plots of land in a place called Yahtan, which must be, I think, the modern neighborhood of Yağdan, north of the citadel of Niğde. And then one linseed oil mill, which, according to the 1483 register, was ruined in 1483. Now, the annual income for this, the totality of these properties was 4,645 akçes in 1483. Okay. The smaller endowment is the one she established to benefit and support descendants of her freed slaves, which was one mezra near Niğde and two villages in the Melendez district, which is the Melendez Mountains west of Niğde. So looking at the picture of the listed properties and locations, it becomes evident that Hüdavenk Hatun's residence in Niğde was accompanied by property ownership, both in the immediate proximity of the city of Niğde and also in nearby districts such as Altunhisar and Melendez. Although we know that she was purchasing property in the Tokat region from that bill of sale, all the properties listed here are within the broad region of Niğde. So my question is, did she acquire these properties by purchasing them as she did the mezra near Tokat? Or were they perhaps given to her? In the case of the villages, it seems more likely that the revenues were assigned to her, and at this time that assignment would have been made by the Mongol Ilkhanate authorities, presumably. The other properties, gardens and such, were possibly purchased by her. The key question here is, of course, what brought Hüdavenk Hatun to Niğde? One possibility is that her move here from Tokat was somehow decided for her, and if so, we don't know the reasons. But again, it could have been orchestrated by the Ilkhanate authorities. Another possibility is that her move had something to do with her relationship to this emir named Şucaettin Uğurlu, who acted as her representative in Tokat in 1303, and whose name appears again on that second cenotaph in the Hüdavenk Hatun tomb as the father of this woman named Pasha Hatun. The first thing that comes to mind is that Hüdavenk Hatun may have been married to Şucaettin Uğurlu sometime around the turn of the 14th century, but that is just a guess. And just in the last few days, I came across a very recent publication that further complicates the profile of Şucaettin Uğurlu. So I think we should not come to immediate conclusions about his relationship to Hüdavendt Hatun. In any case, it is clear that Hüdavendt Hatun and Şucaettin Uğurlu were somehow associated with each other. Another thing we know about him is that he was economically connected to the region south of Niğde, more specifically to the silver mines of the Bolkar Mountains, which is part of the middle Taurus range south of Niğde. So this area at the bottom of this map and up here is Niğde. This information comes to us from the 14th century historian El-Umari, who states that Şucaettin Uğurlu had 20,000 cavalry soldiers at his command, and that he held sway over Lulua, the Byzantine castle of Lulon, and a place called Kumuşşehir, which must be one of the silver mining settlements in the Bolkar Mountains. Most likely the village today known simply as Gümüş, silver, which is, here's Ulukış, the district capital today, Ulukışla, and this Gümüş village is a little bit to the southeast of that. It's not indicated on this map. So El-Umari makes quite clear also that Şucaettin Uğurlu was in the business of mining silver, which undoubtedly accounts for his position of influence as well as of military power. Today, this region is incorporated in the district of Ulukışla. However, the name of the district in the Ottoman period, going all the way back to the 1476 endowment register, is in fact Şucaettin. Right, it becomes a district name, which really speaks to the political legacy of this person in the region of southern Cappadocia. So without knowing great many details about either Hüdavendt Hatun or Şucaettin Uğurlu, it seems quite certain that these two figures were commanding significant resources in the rural landscape of southern Cappadocia. Our next endowment is the one established by one Sungur Ağa to support the large Friday mosque with an attached tomb that he built in Niğde in the lower town, just below the fortification walls of the city, which you see here. Today, it's referred to as the Sungur Bey Cami. The mosque doesn't have a foundation inscription, but its minber inscription states that it was ordered by Seyfettin Sungur Ağa during the reign of the last Ilhanid ruler, Abu Said. Abu Said was the last Ilhanid ruler, and he reigned between 1316 and 1335. So he must have, because the minber doesn't have a date, but it gives the name of the Ilhan who dies in 1335. That kind of spells the end of the Ilhanids. So the mosque, typically a minber is a thing that's created or made for the mosque when it is finished. So the mosque must have started to be built before 1335. Who exactly Sungur Ağa is hard to say. He appears to be one of the numerous men with the title Ağa who emerge in the various parts of, especially central Anatolia, in the middle decades of the 14th century. It is usually assumed that these Ağas are Mongol men who emerged to fill the political military vacuum in the course of the weakening and then the collapse of the Ilhanids. In the In the case of Sungur Ağa in Niğde, it seems that he started his mosque project while Abu Said was still the Ilhanid ruler. This would mean that he was probably active in Niğde during the last years of Hüdavendt Hatun's life. And one wonders what kind of a relationship may have existed between those two. Now, when we look at the 1476 and 1483 endowment registers, we see a combination of rural agricultural assets with urban commercial assets. Here I've listed, I took this from the 1476. The 1483 register is more or less, has the same picture. There are a few more plots of land and shops mentioned there, but it doesn't really change the picture. So the endowed properties for the Sungur Ağa Mosque are 2 villages in the Melegüp district, which is modern Derinkuyu, and then 3 villages near Niğde, 1 village in the Melendez district, 2 plots of land around Niğde, 1 garden at the edge of Fertek village, which is also very close to Niğde, and then 1 cook's shop, a dükkan-ı tabbah, next to the mosque, 2 shops and 8 stalls, seki, near the mosque, and then 3 shoemaker shops. Now, so from here we can see that Sungur Ağa was in a position to collect the revenues of some 6 villages, both near Niğde and then further north to Derinkuyu and west to Melindez. In a way, this is similar to Hüdaven Hatun, whose 2 endowments, if we combine her 2 endowments, they bring up the same number of villages. The similarity also seems to hold for possession of plots of land and gardens and the like. Where the 2 patrons and the 2 endowments differ is Sungur Ağa's possession of commercial urban property in the form of a number of shops. If we focus on these shops, we can build up a picture of Niğde's commercial spaces. One thing that becomes clear is that most of the shops he owned were right in the vicinity of the mosque. Of course, we don't know if these shops existed before the mosque or if Sungur Ağa had them built together with the mosque as part of the endowment project. It's interesting that one of them is a cook's shop, but of course, this is the information from 1483. It doesn't mean that that shop was always a cook's shop. But it's interesting that it is right next, it's mentioned as being right next to the mosque. Together with 2 other unspecified shops and 8 stalls, the area around the mosque appears to have commercial activity on different scales of operation. How much of the commercialization of the space may be due to the agency of Sungur Ağa is not something we can really know. But one further clue in this aspect of the area of the mosque is a tax inscription by Sungur Ağa that is found on the base of the mosque's minaret, and it is that this inscription is dated 1335. The inscription announces an exemption of jizye and haraj taxes from the so-called Gurabaye Milleti Mesih, which, depending how we translate Guraba, either as foreigners, strangers, or the poor people, but clearly Milleti Mesih refers to the Christians. So either case, we're not exactly sure who this is referencing, if it's meant to be Guraba in the sense of poor people. It might be, local native Christians of this part of Cappadocia. Or if it's referring to foreigners, it could be any number of foreigners, including those of European descent, maybe coming from Cilicia, or maybe from Cyprus. And I'm not looking at the architecture of these buildings, but it is the case that the Sungur Ağa Mosque has a number of features that show a connection to this kind of international Gothic style. So maybe one speculation is that this inscription refers to maybe Frankish craftsmen whom maybe Sungur Ağa invited here or had them settled here and gave them this kind of tax exemption, which he announced on the minbar, on the minaret inscription. However, we may interpret the beneficiaries of this tax exemption. The inscription speaks to Sungur Ağa's apparent freedom to take initiative on his own in the same year that the Ilkhanate collapsed in 1335. So if the Goraba here, that refers to foreign Christians settling in Niğde, it would further enhance the picture of Sungur Ağa's mosque being embedded into a particularly maybe vibrant commercial space. Okay, now the last major endowment to look at is the one established by the Karamanid prince and governor of Niğde, Ali Bey, for his medrese, known as the Ak Medrese, built further west than, and you can see it here, here's the Sungur Ağa, and here is the Ak Medrese. The foundation inscription here dates the building to 1409, 1410. Its surviving endowment deed is dated 1415, so it's a few years afterwards. At this time, Ali Bey was subordinated to his older brother, Mehmet Bey, based in the Karamanid capital of Larende, modern Karaman. These brothers were the sons of Alaaddin Ali Bey, the Karamanid ruler of the late 14th century, and his Ottoman wife. Their father was killed by Bayezid I, after which he, that is Bayezid I, annexed the Karamanid territories and took the two brothers, and they are his nephews, to Bursa. After the turn of the 15th century and Timur's invasion of Anatolia and defeat of the Ottomans, the two brothers came back to central Anatolia and reclaimed their patrimony with Timur's support. So that's the background of Ali Bey in a very small nutshell. Let's look at his endowment for the Ak Medrese. This includes some villages, one village with 2/3 of its mill near Niğde, two villages, but of half share, again, near Niğde, and then gardens adjoining the medrese, plots of land and gardens near the same village of Fertek, again, near Niğde, and then a cloth market, a Bezazistan in Niğde, a khan or a caravansaray between that cloth market and the mosque of Sungur Ağa, two adjoining hammams in Niğde, 8 shops near those hammams, half of a bread bakery. Sorry, I put one bread bakery, that should be half. And then one linseed oil mill near Niğde. According to the 1483 register, the linseed oil mill, the bakery, and surprisingly the cloth market were in a state of ruin and not generating income. Otherwise, the endowed properties of the 1415 endowment seem to have survived into the Ottoman period in the late 15th century. First off, I think it's interesting to see one similarity with Hüdavendt Hatun Zaviye endowment, which is that both Ali Bey's medrese and Hüdavendt Hatun Zaviye were located at some distance from this walled city. Hüdavendt Hatun's is up here. It's even that hers is even further away, but his is also a little bit of a distance away. And also, both of these buildings had adjacent gardens, or in the case of Hüdavendt Hatun, they were adjacent vineyards, the income from which was allocated for their respective institutions. This enhances the impression we gain from Ibn Bibi's account, if you remember that, of Zahireddin İli's interest in the gardens surrounding Niğde at the beginning of the 13th century. We can surmise that in this case, both institutions here were built on what was productive suburban agricultural land, and that the endowments ensured the remaining part of those gardens to have a kind of a symbiotic existence with their respective adjacent institution. So, but that's a kind of a detailed observation. The bigger picture that we have is that in the case of Ali Bey's medrese endowment, the role of urban income generating commercial property has really taken off and appears to have overshadowed the rural income, especially those from the villages. This suggests that in the period following Hüdavenk Hatun and then Sungur Ağa, that is from the middle of the 14th century onwards, Niğde under Karamanid power grew in commercial significance and possibly also in population. This development seems to have put Ali Bey in a position to invest in large-scale commercial properties such as the double hammam, which is referred to as new and was probably built by him. It is also probable that Ali Bey also built the cloth market and the caravanserai. In some ways, these buildings followed from Sungur Ağa's urban investment and served to fill out the urban fabric of the lower town. Now, the location of the hammams would have been presumably somewhere around here. This elongated building here is actually a covered market built, but in the 1570s by Sokullu Mehmet Pasha, the Ottoman Pasha. But that may be actually the location, I'm thinking, of the cloth market or of the caravanserai mentioned in this endowment. The trend of commercialization of Niğde is reflected not only in the sequence of the major endowments, but also in the minor endowments, which are constituted by a large number of neighborhood mosques listed in a separate section in both of these 15th century endowment registers. So according to the 1476 register, there were 15 masjids, and according to the 1483 Tahrir, there were 16, so it's almost the same number, 16 masjids. Now, don't worry, I won't go into every single one of these masjids. There are several surviving masjids in Niğde today, which can be dated to the 14th and 15th centuries. And I put two examples there in the photograph, but it is difficult to match up their names with the names given in the registers. There are also a few inscriptions of masjids in the collection of the Niğde Museum that give us dates between 1301 and 1423, which confirms that masjid construction and endowment goes all the way back to the beginning of the 14th century, if not earlier. One of the 15 or 16 masjids which are recorded in the two registers, of the 15 or 16 masjids which are recorded in the two registers, a few must date to the early 14th century, but we can't tell which ones those would be. The other thing we can't tell is their particular locations. So that's a bit of a handicap. But that being said, let's look at, I've chosen 4 examples from the 1483 register. One masjid of Veys Hoca that has the largest endowment of 430 akçes. You can see the endowment include a perfumer's shop, a cook's shop, a bootmaker's shop, then some agricultural property, garden in Aravani village, close to Niğde, plot of land again near the same village, a plot of land in this neighborhood of Niğde, Yahdan, and then gardens in Fertek village. Okay, so here we see kind of a even distribution of commercial and agricultural property. Then a smaller endowment is the Mescid-i Tat Ahmet. It has the endowment has a shop in front of the Bezzazistan, the cloth market. Apparently, that's it generates good rent income in the order of 100 akçes, because typical shops at this time in 1483 seems to generate about 60 akçes a year, 50, 60. So this one is kind of expensive. There's a shop, and then he also has a stall, which is a quarter of the income, 25 akçes. And then he also has a plot of land in a place called, I don't know where that is, Ziri Köşk, and then a garden plot, 10 akçes. So it's similar to the Veys Hoca, but on a smaller scale. And then we have these two that I picked, Mescid-i Burhaniye, again, relatively small, we might say, compared to the Veys Hoca one. But this one consists all of commercial property. So a sword maker's shop, a cook's shop, a weaver's shop, and then a ruined shop in the Aravani village market. And similar to the Burhaniye is the Mescid-i Tahtalu, which again has these shops in its endowment. Again, a perfumer's shop, a physician's shop, a tailor's shop, and a goat hair spinner's shop, and then a ruined shop, which is not at least ruined in 1483. So to my mind, one thing that these masjid endowments seem to reflect is the way people of some economic means apparently made property investments, and commercial property, especially shops, seems to be a very kind of conspicuous investment. Some of these endowments show a kind of a spread in property ownership between town and country, but others show exclusively urban commercial property. Now, the Burhaniye is all commercial, but one of them is in a village market, a shop in a village market rather than a city market, right? Although we can't put these masjid endowments in chronological order, the evidence from the major endowments we looked at from the 14th to the early 15th centuries does show a trend towards greater commercialization that may perhaps be also true for the minor endowments. Of course, I don't want to imply that this is a simple pattern born of a simple series of equations. I think there are probably a good number of variables in these equations, starting with social and political variables, having to do with the identity of the founders, their background, and their agency. And just looking at the life stories of Hüdavend Hatun or Ali Bey, we realize how much turmoil and ups and downs are integrated into their profiles. These no doubt have significance in how they positioned themselves as they negotiated the privileges of status with the hazards of a turbulent era. Even with the knowledge that there are many variables that we may not be able to account for or factor in to our analyses, I think there is still something to be gained from a slow perusal of the kind of documents that I have shared today. These documents are not unknown entities, right? The 1476 register was transcribed and published in 1952. The Ak Medrese endowment deed was transcribed and published in 1942. So they have been available for a long time. However, till now, they have been used primarily as hard data for economic history to gauge changes in revenues in various regions. There have been some more creative uses every now and then of such documents, but rarely have they been used in their kind of totality. For example, in writing urban or rural histories of pre-Ottoman Anatolia. What makes them especially valuable, as I hope I have been able to suggest today, is how they reflect the interdependence of urban and rural histories. And clearly there's a lot more to be done. And if this kind of work can get any traction, not just looking at the quantitative, but also the qualitative aspect of the information, I think it has the potential to enrich our understanding of resource management in medieval Anatolia's urban-rural interface. Thank you. I'll end there because we're just filled 1 hour, I think, right there.
Sorry, thank you very much, Oya, for this presentation and this very clear. And I think you clearly show the interest of this endowment deeds to understand the dynamics between urban and rural context in medieval Anatolia. I'll stop the recording because as we say, we don't record the Q&A session, and after leave the